Welcome, everyone, to the next episode of Search Off the Record podcast. Our plan is to talk a bit about what's happening at Google Search, how things work behind the scenes, and maybe have some fun along the way. My name is Lizzi Sassman, a tech writer on the search relations team here at Google in Switzerland. And today I'm joined by Martin Splitt, who is also on the search relations team. And we're here to chat with Ryan Levering, a software engineer at Google, about all things structured data. So let's get into it. So I wanted to talk to both of you. Hi, by the way. Did not give you like an entry point to say hello. But hello, how are you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good. It's good to see you.
Are you as excited as I am for the structured data conversation?
I don't know. Yes, probably. How are we measuring excitement levels?
Is there structured data for it?
There might be a schema.org for it, yeah.
Is structured data a method of measurement?
But representation of the actual data, yeah.
Yeah, like a review, for instance, is a way of measuring your experience with something. Like, is it a good thing? Is it a terrible thing? So why not measure excitement or describe excitement?
Speaking of types of structured data, I was wondering if you guys had a favorite type.
Ooh, I absolutely do, actually. So my favorite type is the article because it's what you need to make a web story. And I like web stories.
It's a good thing that Gary is not here to hear you say that. Ryan, do you have a favorite type? Or is this like picking a favorite child?
What a great question. Article is a very nice thing because it's definitely a widely used type, I would say. But I would say if I had to pick my favorite type, it would probably be events. That was sort of one of the best ecosystems, I think, where structured data really shined for Google. Just the way the data is distributed on the web and the problems that we've had consuming it make events a really good structured data vertical, particularly for search.
You know, I think that events was actually my first documentation project when I joined the Google search team. And structured data was my first like larger project to sort of work on a structure for the structured data docs. I'm sorry. To sort of make them, they were all like not using a consistent format. And events was, I think, launching at the time. So it was a new doc. And I sort of used that as a way to pilot out how we would do like the ordering of the information in the structured data docs. And that's actually how I first heard of structured data. I did not know it was a thing before working on the docs, which is sort of a good thing. Often as a tech writer, you're like first to the scene for a feature or something, and you kind of have the eyes as a beginner to see something for the first time. But I was wondering what your first introduction to structured data was.
For me, it was actually micro formats, and I didn't realize that this would be also considered structured data. And then like the first time I properly heard structured data as a term coming from Google was with Google Now. I don't know if you guys remember Google Now, this wonderful thing that like basically Google Assistant before it was Google Assistant, where you could have emails that contained JSON-LD or microdata with, for instance, event markup. And then Google would prompt you like, hey, you have to leave now to get to this event that is happening in an hour. So that was my first touch point.
And Ryan, I think your touch point goes a little bit further back in time because you have told me that you had a thesis paper.
Yeah. So the thesis paper was not on structured data per se. It was on web page classification. So machine learning and web pages have been in my background for a while. But I would say, I mean, structured data is a really funny term because we use it sort of in strange ways at Google. I mean, a database is structured data to some degree. And I think that can be sort of confusing. Usually when we say structured data, we sort of are a little bit overlapping with markup as a term. So like structured data that's embedded on web pages, or structured data that's in some sort of standardized form.
Yeah, I mean, HTML is structured data.
Yeah, HTML is also structured
markup
data.
Too, or schema. Like we're using like, sometimes I hear structured data markup or schema markup or all combinations of these words to refer to this thing, but they could also be things on themselves. Anyway.
The terminology is a little bit strange, but usually we mean it in terms of as comparison to unstructured web data is usually where it's used. So like unstructured text or other things that we're not indexing in the same way. So structured data, usually you can do more interesting things with it because the data has, you don't have to worry about parsing it and understanding its meaning because it's already semantically there.
Right. So the way that I think of it, and correct me if that's right or wrong, I think like the structured data in terms of markup, like HTML and whatever is out there in the web, that's like human readable. And then we have a machine readable form as well. And that's what I would classify as structured data, like something that is addressing the machine, like the search engine, for instance, rather than the human going on a website, because we're not showing the JSON LD to people, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's a good way to think about it, I think. So my introduction, when I started at Google, we were working on extraction from web pages. So like doing it via ML. So we came in and the first thing I worked on was the data highlighter product, which is externally. So we were looking at web pages and pulling structured data from unstructured text. And my whole team was very into the actual ML aspects of it. So how do we extract data, which in academics circles is often called wrapper induction. So when you take you build a wrapper that can pull the data out of a template. So reverse engineer the database. But after several years of working on it, there was another project that was sort of a side-by-side that was extracting structured data, which became like the core of what we use now. And I became convinced after talking to people for a long period of time that it was much easier to just ask people to give us their data rather than to pull it off of the web pages. It's surprisingly more accurate. There's other problems that can happen because of that, but it's generally an easier thing to do. And it's a lot less work for us, and it's a lot better for the provider. So I came to it from ML and sort of seeing structured data as the enemy at first. And then I sort of was won over as a good mechanism.
Wow, structured data as the enemy. I don't think I ever imagined that you would say that. You are like the poster child of structured data.
Probably because I started on the opposite side, so I became convinced. I think that makes a more loyal follower.
So we've been talking about how machines use structured data to understand the content of a web page, which is oftentimes how we explain the concept of structured data, like what it is and why we would need to do this. What do we mean by understanding, and how much of it is machine learning versus this other thing that you've been mentioning? Like we were moving away from machine learning models to providers telling us exactly what the data fields are. It sounds like machine learning to me.
No. So machine learning I see it as sort of like multiple prongs on our approach for how we get stuff. So we want to use machine learning for cases where either we don't have more information, where it's not provided for us, but it's always going to be easier to just have the data shown to us, I think. So we'll try, I think it's like a multi-tiered approach where you have like machine learning for cases where we don't have that data specifically, but then providers always have the option of giving us data, which usually improves accuracy, which usually gives better benefit for the actual provider. So I always see them as sort of like working side by side in an ideal world.
I see. So you don't have to do anything, but if you want to give us more specific information, then you would use structured data, but we're also trying to do it for you if, say, you don't have the time or bandwidth to add it to your site?
Most of our features over time sort of migrate to that approach, where we ingest it. Maybe we start with one approach where we're just using ML, and then we eventually add markup so people have control, or it's the opposite way around. And we bootstrap with markup and an ecosystem approach where people are giving us data, and then we enhance coverage of the feature by adding ML long run. So I see them as very compatible, but it's always good to empower people who are giving you data to have control over that. So I think it's really important that structured data in general is part of the overall strategy so that people can actually have some control over the content that we show.
Yeah. Also, speaking of control, I guess we can never probably just use one of the tiers, because I'm guessing people will also try to exploit the ability to give us data, to give us incorrect data, to boost their sites in a non-valid way, or like to game the system. So I guess that's also a challenge that we're looking at. Is it? Or am I wrong? And everyone plays nicely on the internet.
No, that's sort of what I alluded to before as there being other challenges in structured data. The primary challenge is that we then have to sort of figure out a way to verify that the structured data is accurate. And sometimes this is from actual abuse, and sometimes this is just because there's a problem with synchronicity. So sometimes people generate structured data for their websites and it becomes out of sync with the actual stuff that's being shown visually. we see a lot of both. So there needs to be other mechanisms to figure out some balancing act where those things are enforced. So that's the cost of structured data, I guess, is that extra checking.
Okay, so I'm bought in with the fact that structured data is important to Google, but there's so many types that are out there. Like Google in the documentation, we've got like 25 different features or more in the search gallery. And then there's also like unlimited, almost it seems, on schema.org, more properties for each of the features, and then more things than we even talk about. It seems overwhelming. Would you have advice for someone who's starting out with structured data? I don't have anything on my site. What should I add? What would be the first place to start, or maybe the most impactful thing to add to my website?
So most of our features right now, especially in the documentation, sort of fall into a category of like specific entity type or like generic website structured data. So several of our features that you see there are like breadcrumbs, site link search box. Those are very generic and they sort of apply to most websites and web pages. So checking out those in general, and then seeing whether or not we have documentation for a specific type would probably be the next thing. So definitely if you're an event site, you should definitely be looking at the event structure data page. If you're a commercial-based website, looking at that. Our review snippets is very popular with a bunch of different verticals. So having the possibility of showing up in search with star ratings are very popular. So I would browse the documentation and realize that some are generic features and some are like more specific features.
And what's kind of the difference between the Google documentation and the schema.org documentation? Because it does seem like there's overlap, but also there's more on schema.org. And why do we have both of them? When would I look at the Google one versus the schema.org site?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there's a lot of confusion about the difference between the two things. Schema.org is a collaboration between multiple companies to create a common vocabulary. That vocabulary is not by any means an API. So it doesn't ever say that things are required for a particular pipeline or of ingestion. So it's just a way of expressing information. It doesn't even really express cardinalities. So you could have multiple booleans attached to a particular thing, which maybe doesn't even make sense, but there's no restriction on that in the actual schema.org documentation. So it's very expansive and it has to account for all of the different use cases that could be used for it.
So is it sort of like looking at a dictionary? Like these are these things, they are here. And the application of those things could be limitless, or like other people can then use this to then say, we need this type of information to do this thing. Or that's the Google aspect, is that it's adding this is what we can do with it if we know this information.
Yes. So Google sort of imposes a set of restrictions on top of schema.org to make the data more usable for our purposes. So we never want to say that the data is incorrect, but it may not be viable for a particular feature. And that's what most of our documentation and our reporting is trying to convey, is that we can't use this structured data for this feature. It does not mean it is incorrect. It does not mean that we will never find it useful or that somebody else might find it useful. It just means that for this given feature, we can't use it. Schema.org is very broad, and we're more specific to the feature.
It's very interesting that you say like we might not use it or it might not be useful, because I think one of the things that I found quite interesting is that when I look at the Web Almanac project from HTTP Archive that does like a yearly crawl of homepages. Now homepages do usually have a bit of structured data as well, but it's very specific. Like for instance, the breadcrumbs, the navigation items, but also a lot of people add website, like the entity website, to their homepages, and I'm always like, It's interesting that people do it. It makes sense because yes, of course, like example.com, that is a website, and adding the structured data never hurts, but is structured data useful beyond what we use for, say, like certain search features such as rich results?
Yeah, the website is definitely used a lot. I think SiteLink Search Box currently uses website to hang off of. So there is one feature that actually uses that specifically for the search actions. So the answer is sort of a little bit vague. We can potentially use that for some things at Google. And I never advise people to not put structured data on their web page if it makes semantic sense, because it also goes into our exploration of what might be possible in the future. So if everybody uses a particular data type and we see it being popular, then that might actually drive feature development. So one way that putting it on your website is that it lets us know that there's a bunch of this stuff out there, and so we might start consuming it in the future. So that's one way that it's useful. We also have some things that we do to sort of generally understand the topic of the page, and sometimes the data you put on that can go into that. Now that's a very ML sort of process where we look at all of the text on the page and we look at other things that have to do with the page. So structured data is just one signal in that overall calculation, but it can help us with certain disambiguations in terms of what the actual page is about. So it is useful, but just in a more implicit sense right now.
Not as obvious to people, since most of the features that we talk about are very rich result driven, where we say, if you give us this information, we could show your site in this type of presentation, but there are other things that are not necessarily something that you could see visually, but it could help us know that this is a recipe page when I didn't know based off of other information. And it's sort of interesting that we still need that kind of hint.
Yeah, and it's tricky because, like I said, if you don't put structured data on your page, we might be getting it fully correct. So it's hard to convey that in some of our reporting and stuff that we actually find this useful, because it's a nuanced sort of calculation. But when there is problems detecting it, we can use it as an extra signal. So it's usually on the edge cases where we find that stuff useful.
That's really, really cool. And I think it's generally easy to say like more data, as long as it is correct and reflects what's shown to the user on the page, is never worse, right? It's always better to add more data to clarify what the content on the page is.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've been very cognizant about. Like if we do change something in the documentation where it's like, oh, we no longer need this piece of information, if we remove it from the recommendations, then will people think, oh, should I remove this from my website completely? Like it's no longer useful, which is not necessarily the case, because there could be other tools or systems out there, like not Google, using the structured data. And if that's gone from your website, then there's less information just generally available on the web. And it's interesting how sometimes the implication of that just sort of spirals into this other realm. But I have added structured data to a couple of the pages in our documentation. So I've done FAQ and I've done how to, and I also did breadcrumb. But everything's been like a manual approach, where it's like I take this one page and then I'm adding it like in microdata line by line, and I haven't approached it from like a massive site, but I'm assuming that would be something where SEOs and developers need to collaborate on reading the requirements and like the content that goes into the fields versus like how do you say where the fields are injected. And I know Martin and Ryan, you've both worked together to write documentation for how you can systematically generate this.
Yes, we've done that, and it's super interesting because like a few things that Ryan said in the podcast right now reminded me of the discussions we had to write this documentation, because it is not always easy, it is not always simple, and I think that's why lots of people use CMSs, because then they have solutions that can blanket apply structured data to a large number of pages and a large number of types of content. But then Ryan reminded me like, yeah, but how do you ensure that there's no drift between what is on the page and what is in the structured data, so that they stay in sync? And I'm like, okay, that's actually not necessarily easy. Because there's different ways of dealing with that, right? So your CMS can allow the user to create content and then actually tag it in a way that is represented as structured data on the page later on. Like, for instance, when you have a recipe blog and you have a CMS and you add a new recipe to it, then there might be additional fields besides the full text that you put in that ask you for all the information that is necessary to express this in structured data as a recipe as well. Or you could build something into it that pulls the data, as Ryan said, the data in the database that feeds a dynamic website oftentimes already is structured. So there might be a database that has all this information in a structured way, and we just need to express the structured data not only in a human readable form, but also automatically fill in the JSON LD markup, for instance. And that's something that is relatively easy to maintain and do. But then there might be people who don't have as many access to developer resources as others, and then they might use, for instance, Google Tag Manager with a custom piece of JavaScript to pull out the information that is already human readable in the page and then create structured data from it. And there are like a bunch of different solutions, and we have a wonderful piece of documentation that explains them all and their potential positive and negative aspects. But it is not trivial. And I remember that, I think, Ryan, you were mostly worried about the human readable side and the machine readable side to stay in sync, if that was, or at least that's in my memory, right?
I do see that as like a common question as well. Like, I'm, updating the price on my page. Like, is this a problem, or how do I keep these things in sync? And will Google be upset with me if the things are not matched? Because we also have that in the guidelines that what you have in the structured data must match the content on the page to not be spammy and that kind of thing. But what if I am just like, oh, I have a technical problem, or this is a mistake, or something changed and I forgot or didn't know I inherited this site, or something breaks in the system. It seems like this could be a common problem if you are doing this kind of setup. How would you approach, like, how does Google make sure to not penalize sites like this?
I think the key is to make sure that the thing that's generating, like Martin alluded to, that the thing that's generating your content is coming from your database directly, and it's not really manual. There's approaches that are more likely to stay in sync. Like if you use RDFA or microdata, generally it is wrapping the content, so it tends to stay more in sync. Those are sometimes harder formats to actually use. And it's sometimes easier to inject JSON LD, which is why JSON LD is sort of preferred these days, is that it's harder to mess up. But if you're concerned about keeping those things in sync, I think looking at microdata or RDFA is a good way to go. What's
difficult about the microdata or RDFA? Like, what is it? Because it's easier to miss a closing tag or something, or like, do people, when you say people make mistakes, what is more difficult about those approaches?
Yeah, it's because you're imposing a sort of a structured data semantics on top of the HTML. So your HTML is mostly being written for visual display, and then you're imposing like semantics on top of that, which sometimes fits very nicely, but often the data is structured visually in a way that you would not structure it in a feed or something. So because of that, it becomes tricky to structure it, and you have to do fancy things with microdata that are non-intuitive.
I've run into that problem where there's like some piece of information that the Google Docs say that I need to provide, but I don't necessarily have that on the page. Like, where do I put it? And I have to put it in like a hidden way, but is that hidden text, or like, is it fine to put it like that, or some like tricky thing? Whereas with JSON LD, it seems like here's just the block of information. It's at the top, like no weird moving around of the parts because the whole thing is hidden.
Correct. Yeah. We try to only do checks on the sort of the pertinent information on the structured data you're giving us. So if there's extra metadata, like in JSON LD or in microdata in meta tags, I think you're alluding to, then we don't check for that particular stuff usually. But I mean, well, I just wanted to add the point on this topic that JSON LD, one of the problems with JSON, which is addressed in documentation as well, is that we have to fetch a different resource. So that can also provide a synchronicity problem. And that's the reason why it's sometimes better to go with approaches that are embedded on the website, even the web page itself, even if that sort of makes it more difficult to separate, just because there's a chance that we're not downloading the JavaScript at the same time that we're downloading the HTML. So there's a chance for a synchronicity problem in that case.
How would I know that I had this kind of a problem? Like if I was the website owner that like, oh, Google is not fetching the JavaScript part of the structured data on my page, would I get a message from Search Console about this, or would this be like completely hidden from me? Maybe this is a Martin question.
I think generally that would show up in search in the Search Console. No, Ryan?
No, I think it would. I think that our testing tools will actually sort of show that.
Like the whole thing is
test
missing, not
accurate.
just like, oh, you didn't provide us this one property. Like suddenly we are not able to find this entire block.
I mean, with the asynchronicity, the problem more likely is that you have some sort of invalid and broken template that hasn't been filled in yet. And then we'd be like, this doesn't look right.
So it might be a little confusing, actually.
To know that it means that it's a synchronicity problem. We know that like it's easy to see that there is something wrong here, but what is the culprit? The next question that might be a little bit harder to debug.
Yeah, definitely. Because you would have to look into the testing tools. The testing tools might not, because this is kind of like a race condition. So multiple things happen at the same time. And depending on what takes how long, the order might change. And then in the testing tools, it might look like this. But then when we did it in the indexing pipeline, it looked different. And then catching that is non-trivial. That is actually, it requires a bit of experience and digging, I would say.
That's definitely gotten better over the last couple of years, though. We've done a lot of work of reducing the cache time for some of the data fetches, which has helped structured data out a lot.
Yeah, speaking of the work that has been done, what about the work that's to come? The next couple of years for structured data, if you were to give us a peek into the future, what is next for structured data?
In the medium term, I think we continue to flesh out the structured data usage in terms of like adding more features and looking into more ways we can use it in cooler things that are not just visual treatments, but actually help with more understanding on the page, I think, and figuring out how to use structured data more universally in a lot of our features, rather than just sort of like here and there scattered around. I think that's what we're looking at sort of in the medium term. Long term, I think that it's going to play a really interesting role at interacting with the way that we interpret data in general into our internal graph. So I would like to see more machine learning, figuring out sort of I would like to move to where we are ingesting more and more data through structured data specific channels, rather than necessarily conveying all of our information on the web page itself. So I think that's a much cleaner approach, particularly for some of our structured data ingestion paths. So figuring out a way to get around the actual visual representation and figuring out ways to link the structured data with the web page, but not necessarily embedded on the web page. So I think there's a cleaner way to do data transfer between data providers and Google.
Would this also potentially make it easier for new website owners to benefit from some of these, enhancements at Google, if we were to be able to pull the information in a different way?
I think that it will make it easier for plugins and CMSs to create that information, particularly because I feel like a lot of the ecosystem has sort of moved in that direction, where people aren't implementing the structured data themselves, but rather are using like content creation tools. I think it's becoming more important that we have mechanisms to work directly with those content creation tools to ingest the data in a programmatic way in order to make it fresher and easier.
Excellent. Well,
That sounds exciting.
Looking forward to working more with you and hopefully more structured data documentation for general usage. We're so happy that you joined us here on this episode. And that's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us here, folks. We've been having fun with this podcast, and I hope you, the listener, have found it both entertaining and insightful too. Feel free to drop us a note on Twitter at Google Search C, or chat with us at one of the next virtual events we go to if you have any thoughts. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you and goodbye.